All right, folks. Welcome back to the Cryptid Counterculture. I'm glad y'all are here. If you've been listening along with me, then you already know what this show is about. This show is about asking harder questions, not just parroting the same old opinions, not just grabbing hold of one explanation because it feels safe and never letting go, and not acting like every mystery has already been solved just because somebody slapped a label on it and called it a day. Around here, we talk about cryptids, unexplained encounters, strange happenings, old stories, modern sightings, and all of them places where folklore, witness testimony, instinct, and mystery all seem to run together. And we do it with an open mind, not a gullible mind, and not a shut off mind either, an open mind, because there is a difference. Tonight, I want to get into something that I think is one of the most overlooked patterns in cryptid encounters. And once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Not just in Dogman reports, not just in Bigfoot reports, not just in the stranger stories people like to wave off and laugh at. I'm talking about where these things are seen. Because for creatures people claim that are so elusive or so hidden, so deep in the wilderness, they sure do get seen an awful lot in places that ain't fully wild and ain't fully human either. That's the part I want to dig into tonight. Because cryptid encounters seem to happen over and over again in what people call liminal spaces. The edge of the woods, a tree line behind a field, a dirt road cutting through the forest, a creek crossing, a ridge, a berm, a power line clearing, the edge of a campsite. That place where one kind of space starts giving way to another. Not deep, untouched wilderness, not right downtown either, but the in-between. And that raises a real question. If these things are flesh and blood creatures, then why are they so often seen in them in-between places? And if they ain't just flesh and blood, if there's something paranormal or interdimensional going on, then is that why they show up there? Are they near us because that's where territories overlap? Or are they near us because that's where worlds overlap? That's what we're getting into tonight. So settle in, because this one may get a little uncomfortable. Because by the end of this episode, I want us all asking this question. What if cryptids are seen in liminal spaces? Because that's where the veil is thin. Now, before we get started, if you've had an encounter with Dogman, Bigfoot, or anything you can't explain, you can email me at thecryptidcounterculture@gmail.com. And you can also join the Facebook group Discovering Dogman and the Unexplained. I want to hear your stories, your theories, your disagreements, all of it. Because one thing that I truly believe in my whole heart is this. We are not going to get any closer to the truth by shutting down conversation. We get closer by letting different ideas get in the room together and seeing what actually holds up. Now, before we get too far down this road, let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Liminal is one of them words that gets thrown around a lot these days. It sounds fancy, it sounds spooky, and a lot of folks use it just to mean creepy. But that ain't really what it means. A liminal space is basically a threshold, a transition point, a boundary place. It's where one thing starts becoming another thing. Not fully here, not fully there. Not one world, not the other. You know, it's the hallway instead of the room, the doorway instead of the house, the shore instead of the lake, the tree line instead of the deep woods. It's the road cutting across the mountain instead of the mountain itself. It's that in-between place. And what's interesting is people have always reacted to those kinds of places in a certain way. They don't just feel like locations. They feel loaded. A dark road at night does not feel the same as your driveway. A tree line at dusk does not feel the same as standing out in an open field. A creek crossing the middle of nowhere does not feel like standing in your backyard. There's just something about thresholds that gets your attention. And I think part of that is practical. For thousands of years, thresholds mattered. The edge of the forest is where danger could come from. The crossing in the road is where people met strangers. The bend in the trail is where you couldn't see what was waiting ahead. The doorway was where something could enter. Human beings are built to notice boundaries, and maybe that's all this is. Maybe cryptid encounters feel more meaningful in liminal spaces because we're already on edge in those places. That's a possibility, and I want to be fair about that. But here's where it gets harder to brush off. It ain't just that liminal spaces feel creepy. It's that witnesses keep describing encounters happening there. Not random locations, but specific kinds of locations. Edges, crossings, thresholds, transition points. And when you start noticing that pattern over and over, you have to ask yourself, is that just because those are places where people happen to be? Or is it there actually something about those places themselves? If you listen to enough encounter reports, and I know a lot of y'all do, you start hearing the same settings come up again and again. Not identical stories, not identical creatures, but real similar locations. Somebody driving down a back road at night and something crosses in front of them. A hunter at the edge of a field sees something standing just inside the trees. A family camping hears movement circling just beyond the firelight. A witness sees a figure on a ridge, on a burn, on a rise, looking down. Somebody near a creek or drainage ditch notices something moving in and out of cover. Time and time again, it ain't I was 30 miles deep in untouched wilderness. Usually it's more like I was close enough to human space to know just how wrong this felt. And that matters. Because if cryptids were simply deep forest animals that avoid us at all costs, then the sightings ought to cluster way more heavily in remote, hard to reach places where human beings hardly ever go. But that's not what we hear. What we hear about is roads, edges, tree lines, backyards, farm lines, creek beds, power line cuts, bridges, cemetery roads, and camp perimeters. And a lot of these places ain't just liminal in the physical sense. They're liminal in a human sense too. They're the places where people are often between states themselves, driving home late, walking from one place to another, camping away from home, hunting at dawn or dusk, sitting somewhere between sleep and full alertness, outside the normal rhythm of everyday life. That's worth paying attention to, because whether you believe these encounters are biological, paranormal, or something in between, they seem to happen when both the place and the person are in a kind of threshold state. Now, before we jump straight into veils and dimensions and all of that, let's do what we ought to do first. Let's talk about the normal explanation. Because there are some very real, practical reasons why an unknown creature, if it exists as a biological being, might be seen in a liminal space. First off, edge habitats attract life. In nature, the edge between two environments usually has a lot going on. The edge of woods and field gives cover on one side and visibility on the other. Prey animals move through those places. Deer browse there. Smaller animals cut through there. Predators know that. So if a cryptid is a predator, or even just some kind of opportunistic omnivore, that edge zone would be useful to it. Secondly, roads are travel corridors. A lot of animals use roads, logging cuts, creek beds, and power line clearings because they make movement easier. Anybody who spent time in the woods knows animals will usually take the easiest path available. So if a witness sees something crossing the road, maybe that creature ain't interested in the road itself. Maybe it's just using the easiest cut through the territory. That ain't paranormal. That's practical. Third, observation points matter. Ridges, berms, hilltops, and tree lines give concealment and visibility. If a creature is intelligent and cautious, those are perfect places to watch from. Not unlike a deer pausing at a tree line. Not unlike a coyote hanging back and studying things before moving in. And if Dogman reports in particular are to be believed, a whole lot of those encounters involve not just movement, but observation, watching, standing, assessing. If that's true, then an elevated or partly concealed position makes perfect sense. Fourth, human spaces create food opportunities. Now, I know a lot of folks don't always like this idea because it takes away some of the mystique of it. But it's true. Human beings create edge ecosystem. Livestock, pets, trash, roadkill, bird feeders, crops, small prey drawn in by our activity. A smart predator would notice that. If a cryptid is real and biological, it may not be visiting human spaces because it wants us. It may be visiting because we accidentally reshape the land in ways that are useful to it. And fifth, we have to admit the witness bias problem. People are more likely to see something where people actually are. A creature could spend most of its time deeper in the wilderness, but the places we cross paths with it will naturally be roads, trailheads, campsites, and property edges. That's fair. That's a legitimate explanation. And at this point, somebody could say, all right, there it is. Liminal spaces matter because they're practical overlap zones. End of story. And I'll tell you straight up, that explanation probably does account for some encounters. Maybe a lot of them. But I don't think it accounts for all of them. Because once you start listening carefully to witness reports, the location ain't the only weird thing. It's often the behavior and the feeling around the encounter, too. And that is where the simple explanation starts to strain a little. It's one thing to say a large, unknown animal uses edge habitat. That's easy enough to understand. It's another thing entirely when witnesses describe encounters that feel wrong in ways they can't explain. And I'm not just talking about being scary. Of course, a huge unknown creature is scary. I mean, don't get me wrong. But witnesses describe things like the woods going unnaturally silent, a sudden crushing fear that feels bigger than normal fear, time feeling strained, the creature appearing where it should not have been able to appear, the creature vanishing faster than expected, the witness feeling watched before seeing anything, and a strange sense that the encounter had intention beyond normal animal behavior. Now, some of that can be explained psychologically. A person under extreme stress can absolutely experience time distortion. Fear can absolutely heighten awareness and make things feel unreal. Our brains can absolutely turn an ambiguous moment into something more dramatic after the fact. That's all true. But here's the problem. When enough people who don't know each other from different places, different backgrounds, and different times all describe similar kinds of wrongness, you have to at least pay attention to it. Because then the question stops being, did one witness misread a weird moment? Now the question becomes, why do these stories keep carrying that same strange atmosphere? And this is why I don't think the biological explanation is enough all by itself. Because a normal predator may watch you. A normal predator may stalk a boundary. A normal predator may use terrain intelligently. But a normal predator does not usually leave people talking like they brushed up against something that felt halfway between an animal and an apparition. And that is exactly how some of these reports sound. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to matter. Now, this is where we go a little deeper right here. Because long before folks were using modern words like interdimensional or liminal, people all over the world already believed certain places were different. Not metaphorically, actually different. Crossroads mattered. Doorways mattered. Riverbanks mattered. Forest edges mattered. Cave mouths mattered. Mountain passes mattered. Why? Because people believed boundaries were thin places. Places where the ordinary rules were weaker. Places where you might meet something that did not belong entirely to your world. And I know as soon as you say something like that, some folks tune right out. They hear folklore and think fairy tale. But folklore ain't nothing. Folklore is often memory mixed with meaning. It's generations of people trying to describe patterns they noticed, even if they didn't have the modern language for them. Now, I'm not saying every old tale is literal. I'm not saying every story about spirits at a crossing proves anything. But I am saying this. Human beings across cultures have repeatedly connected threshold places with unusual encounters. And that ought to mean something. Maybe it means we all share the same psychology. Maybe boundaries naturally trigger caution and imagination. Or maybe our ancestors knew something we've gotten too proud to take seriously. And that's one of the reasons I think this conversation matters. Because if we strip all mystery down to the point where we refuse to even consider older ways of seeing the world, then we may be throwing away clues. Not proof, clues. And in cryptid research, clues matter. Now, let's get into the deep water a little bit. What if liminal spaces matter because they are not just ecological edges? What if they are spiritual edges too? Dimensional edges too? What if some cryptid encounters happen in threshold places because those places are easier to cross through? That's the idea a lot of folks dance around but don't always say plainly. So, let's say it plain. What if some of these beings are from the other side of the veil? Now, let me be clear here. I'm not telling you that is what cryptids are. I'm not claiming certainty. I'm not saying every dog man, every Bigfoot, every crawler, every strange thing seen in the woods is some kind of veil crossing entity. But I am saying this theory exists for a reason. It exists because some encounters do not stay neatly inside the animal box. And if witnesses are telling the truth as they experienced it, then some reports sound like an overlap event, like something intruded, like something stepped partly in, like something showed itself where worlds touch. And if that sounds too strange, then just think about how often witnesses describe these creatures almost like they're there and not there at the same time. Physical enough to leave an impression, strange enough to unsettle the mind beyond simple fear. That's where the veil theory starts getting traction. The idea would be this. There are places where reality is somehow thinner, looser, or easier to get through. Threshold places, liminal places. And whatever these beings are, whether spiritual, interdimensional, or something we don't even have a proper word for, they show up there because it's easier. Not because they live in the forest the same way deer do. Not because they den up like bears do. But because the edge places are where they can access us. That is a very different framework. And yeah, I know that framework makes some people uncomfortable. Because once you go there, you ain't just talking about zoology anymore. You're talking about reality itself. And maybe that's exactly why so many people resist it. Not because it's impossible, but because if it is even partly true, then the world is stranger than most folks want to admit. Now, if somebody argues that cryptids may be paranormal, interdimensional, or coming through some kind of veil, what would they point to? Well, they'd point to things like sudden appearance, sudden disappearance, unnatural silence and atmosphere, extreme fear beyond proportion, high strangeness around the encounter, and the slippery nature of the evidence itself. Some witnesses described creatures appearing in places where there should have been no way for them to arrive unnoticed. Some described seeing one, looking away for just a moment, and then it's gone in terrain where that shouldn't even be possible. A lot of witnesses talk about the woods going dead quiet. A lot describe fear that did not feel normal, more like a wave or pressure than an ordinary reaction. Some stories even include weird lights, missing time, strange dreams afterward, electronics acting odd, or animals behaving wrong. Now, I'm not saying all that proves anything, because it doesn't. But it does explain why some people stop thinking in purely biological terms. because the more that kind of stuff clusters around an encounter, the less it looks like just an unknown animal sighting. But then here comes the other side of the problem. If these things are paranormal or crossing through some veil, then why do so many encounters sound physical? Witnesses report footprints, growls, heavy movement, smells, breathing, chest movement, visible muscle, eye shine, sounds of impact, and in some stories, even attacks. That don't sound like some wispy ghost. And this is where the whole conversation gets complicated in the best way. Because maybe the problem is not that one side is completely wrong. Maybe the problem is that we keep acting like there's gotta be only one category. What if some encounters are flesh and blood? What if some are paranormal? What if some are both somehow? What if what witnesses call dogman is not one single thing at all? That would explain a lot. It would explain why some reports sound like dangerous unknown predators and why others sound like somebody brushed up against something from the other side of reality. Most folks won't need answers. It's either an ape, or a demon, or a ghost, or a hoax, or a mutant wolf. Everybody wants the comfort of a box, but reality may not owe us a box. And if these phenomena come from more than one source, then that would explain why the reports are all over the map while still sharing certain patterns. And that's not a cop-out. That may actually be the more honest answer. Messier, yes, but maybe truer. Now, let's really sit with this idea. If there is such thing as a veil, and I know that word means different things to different people, then why would liminal spaces matter? Here's one possible way of looking at it. Threshold places are transitional by nature. A road cuts one world into another. A creek marks a dividing line. A ridge separates visibility from concealment. A tree line is literally a border between open and covered. These are places of change. And if reality itself has weak points, fold, or thin places, maybe those places line up with transition zones more often than with fixed, settled places. Now, do I know that? No. But does the pattern fit? It might. Because if something is moving between states, between realms, dimensions, or planes of existence, whatever language you want to use, then it would make sense for it to appear where transition is already written into the land. I know that's speculative, but speculation is not the enemy if you're honest about it being speculation. The enemy is pretending certainty when you don't have it. And I don't want to do that here. I just want to say plainly that if you believe some encounters involve something crossing over, then liminal spaces make more sense than random places do. That theory actually has internal logic, not proof, logic. Let me say all this in the simplest way I know how. Maybe some of these beings ain't living out there full time the way a deer or coyote does. Maybe some of them are not from the woods in the normal sense. Maybe they're encountered in the woods because the woods, especially the edges, crossings, and lonely places, are where our worlds and something else come close enough to touch. That is the idea. That maybe these beings aren't just hiding. Maybe they're manifesting. Maybe they're not surviving in the ordinary sense. Maybe they are appearing where they can. And maybe that is why witnesses so often see them in those in-between places instead of in some clear, stable, everyday setting. That would also explain why encounters sometimes feel staged almost. Why a creature is seen silhouetted at a tree line. Why it appears on a ridge. Why it stands just outside the firelight. Why it is there for a moment that feels loaded, then gone. Almost like it's not passing through the land. Almost like it's passing through a boundary. Now I want to touch on this carefully, because I know there are folks from different worldviews listening, and I respect that. Y'all know I lean heavily on my Christian worldview. I don't hide it. but I also try not to use it like a hammer and beat every mystery into a shape that suits me. Still, I'd be lying if I said that worldview does not affect how I think about things like this. Because if reality contains both visible and invisible aspects, and I believe it does, then the idea that there are beings, forces, or presences beyond our normal perception is not automatically ridiculous to me. That does not mean every strange thing is a demonic. I think people go way too fast with that sometimes. Not every unexplained sound is a demon. Not every cryptid is some fallen angel. Not every shadow in the woods is some spiritual attack. But I also don't believe the material world is all there is. So when witnesses describe encounters that seem both physical and spiritually wrong somehow, I'm not comfortable just brushing that off. I think it deserves serious thought, especially if the encounter happens in a threshold setting and carries that heavy atmosphere witnesses talk about. Now, to be fair, let's let the skeptic in the room have a say. A skeptic might say liminal spaces are just dramatic places and people remember dramatic places. A skeptic might say people see normal animals at awkward angles and then build a supernatural interpretation around the fear of the moment. A skeptic might say threshold places feel strange for perfectly normal psychological reasons because our brains are wired to be alert there. And a skeptic might say we're taking folklore, witness testimony, and emotional atmosphere and building too much on top of it. That's worth hearing, because if we refuse criticism, we ain't really searching for the truth, are we? We're just defending our favorite ideas. So I think the skeptical voice matters. But here's where I'd answer back. The skeptical explanation can explain some of this, maybe a lot of it. But it does not explain why the same clusters of features keep appearing together. Threshold locations, intense atmosphere, strange witness response, repeated observational behavior, and in some cases, elements that feel beyond normal animal behavior. At some point, skepticism also has to answer the pattern, not just dismiss it. Because people get scared in creepy places is not a full explanation for everything witnesses report. It explains some things, not all things. And too many people confuse partial explanation with total explanation. Those are not the same thing. Here's another thought. What if liminal spaces don't create the encounter, but reveal it? Maybe the reason cryptids are seen at boundaries is because boundaries are places where concealment and revelation meet. At the tree line, something can partly hide and partly show itself. At the road crossing, something can briefly enter our line of sight. At the edge of firelight, something can remain mostly hidden while still being perceived. In that sense, liminal spaces might be where the unseen becomes partly seen. And now that I say that out loud, you can probably hear how that works in both frameworks. Biologically, it makes sense. Paranormally, it makes sense too, which may be why this subject is so powerful, because the same pattern can hold meaning under more than one explanation. That usually means you're touching something real, not solved, but real. I want to slow down here and talk about something most people know in their bones, even if they don't have the words for it. There's a specific feeling that comes over you when you are near the edge of something. The edge of the woods at night, the edge of a drop-off, the edge of a dark road with no lights, the edge of a campfire glow. You're not just in a location. You feel exposed to another space. And that feeling may be ancient. Maybe it's just predator awareness. Maybe it's just nervous system telling you that you cannot fully see what's out there. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe sometimes that feeling is not irrational at all. Maybe it's perception. Maybe human beings, for all our modern arrogance, still have some buried sense for threshold places. And maybe when witnesses say something felt wrong before I ever saw it, we shouldn't automatically downgrade that to imagination. Maybe instinct is data. Not complete data. Not enough by itself, but data nonetheless. And in encounter reports, that pre-sighting sense matters because people often feel the wrongness before the visual confirmation. That tells me the encounter is not only about sight, it's about presence. And that is one more reason why some folks end up thinking there's a veil component to all of this. Because what they are reacting to may not be just a body, it may be an intrusion. Now, here's another thought that gets into deeper territory. What if some of these beings are not merely crossing thresholds? What if they're tied to them? What if certain cryptids are encountered in liminal places because liminal places are their function, not their route? In plain terms, what if they belong to the threshold? That sounds mythic, I know. But think about how many old stories put strange beings at borders. Bridges, gateways, cave mouths, wild margins, forest edges. The being is not always just traveling through. Sometimes it is part of the boundary itself, almost like a watcher, a warning, or a presence tied to that place. Now, I'm not saying I know that this is true, but it does line up with how some witnesses describe these encounters. Not always like random animal crossings, sometimes like confrontations, like being noticed at a place where you were not supposed to go deeper. That could still be territorial animal behavior, absolutely. But if somebody wanted to argue a more paranormal view, they might say these entities are not merely in liminal spaces, they are of liminal spaces. And this is not just spooky campfire talk. It matters for how people research encounters. Because if liminal spaces are important, then that should affect how we read reports. Instead of only asking what did the creature look like, we should also ask where exactly was it seen? What kind of boundary was nearby? Was there water? Was there a ridge? Was there a crossing? Was there a shift in sound? Was it dawn, dusk, or deep night? What was the witness doing emotionally and physically? Did the encounter happen in a place that already felt transitional? Those questions matter because if you map enough reports and start comparing not just creature descriptions but environmental threshold patterns, you may learn more. And honestly, I think a lot of cryptid research has been too shallow on that front. Too much focus on creature type, not enough on encounter setting. Too much energy spent arguing about ape versus demon versus undiscovered canine. Not enough energy spent asking, what is it about these places? That might be one of the missing pieces right there. So where does all this leave us? I think it leaves us with a few things we can say honestly. First, cryptid encounters really do appear to cluster in liminal spaces. That pattern is worth taking seriously. Second, there are solid biological and practical reasons why an unknown creature might be seen in those spaces. Third, some encounters contain elements that do not sit comfortably inside a strictly biological framework. Fourth, folklore from many cultures has long treated threshold places as spiritual or metaphysically significant. And fifth, if there is any truth at all to the idea of a veil, thin places, or interdimensional overlap, then liminal spaces would make a whole lot of sense as encounter zones. Now, that does not prove the veil theory. Let me say that clearly. It does not prove it. But it does make it harder to laugh off. And sometimes in this field, that's an important step. Not proving, just refusing to dismiss too fast. Because dismissal has killed more honest inquiry than mystery ever did. The more I think about it, the more I come back to this. Maybe cryptids are not only creatures of the deep wilderness. Maybe that's one of the first mistakes we make. Maybe they belong to the edge. Maybe that's why people see them where the woods meet the field, where the ridge overlooks the road, where the creek cuts under the bridge, where the firelight gives way to dark. Maybe those places matter because predators like edges. Or maybe they matter because reality itself has edges too. And maybe, just maybe, some encounters happen when those edges line up. A boundary in the land, a boundary in the mind, a boundary in the world itself. And for one moment, something looks back at us from the other side. Not deep in the hidden wild, but right there in the in-between. The place where we have always felt watched. The place our ancestors treated with caution. The place where the dark does not feel empty, but occupied. Maybe that feeling is fear. Maybe it's instinct. Or maybe it's the oldest part of us recognizing something we were never meant to get too comfortable with. Something standing just beyond the line, waiting in the liminal. This has been the Cryptid Counterculture. If you've had an encounter or if you've got thoughts on this episode, email me at thecryptidcounterculture@gmail.com and come join us in the Facebook group Discovering Dogman and the Unexplained. And I want to leave y'all with this question. When people see things, why does it so often happen at the edge? And if that edge is more than just physical, what exactly is standing there?